Hey, folks, good morning and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Joe Mangiacotti Show here on AM 830 WCRN. Now, interesting thing enough, it's not going to be a normal type show because if you're listening to this or seeing this, you're only seeing it on, say, WCRN's Facebook page or my social media platforms, which would be Facebook, X account, Twitch TV, LinkedIn profile, YouTube, Rumble, and yes, even Instagram. So some technical difficulty rather. So we're not actually broadcasting to the station right now. So it's not going out over AM 830 WCRN. And there is a replay on the terrestrial station. So I don't know how we get the word out right now, but I hope that many of you are actually watching the stream now or listening to the stream. I hope you are. And I made the decision to go ahead and just cover the things that we're going to cover on today's show anyway, even if we aren't getting out to the terrestrial signal, because believe it or not, a lot of work does go into prepping on a show and putting things together. So the normal housekeeping, I would say, to reach us at 508-871-7000 and all of that. However, given that we're not going to the station, calling 508-871-7000 isn't going to matter. But you can actually still text me at 617-297-8388, 617-297-8388. The text line is up and running, and that can operate independent of the station. So it is on a screen here in the studio in real time. So if you'd like to text me for the next, and we'll do about the normal hour of a show, but you can call, all right? So you can use the Cameo studio line. That is 508-871. Yeah, see, I was going to give you the station. Call the Cameo line. And if you'd like to come on the show that we're just streaming out all over the different platforms, Facebook, X, and everything, you can do that at 508-556-4411, 508-556-4411. I'm actually going to change the number, I guess, on the Chiron here just for today. And that way there, if you're looking at this, the number's there, 556, and that's 4411. And I'm going to change it right now. And it will ring here, and I'll be able to patch you in, and we can do live calls, even though we're not doing the terrestrial type of show. And one of the reasons I decided that I was going to stream the show today with or without the station signal is because we lost an incredible person yesterday. Dolly Parton passed away. And Dolly was always there. Now, there are celebrity deaths that you report. There are celebrity deaths that surprise you. And then there are those very few that somehow feel personal, even though you never actually knew the person. Yesterday, we lost Dolly Parton, and this one hurts. I have been trying to figure out exactly why Dolly's passing makes me sad as it does, and I think I've figured it out. Dolly was always there. Dolly Parton was famous before I was born. From my earliest memories, there was Dolly, that unmistakable voice. That enormous blonde hair, the rhinestones, the laugh, the sense of humor. And beneath this larger-than-life character was an extraordinarily talented songwriter, a remarkably smart businesswoman, a woman of faith, and by seemingly every account, a genuinely decent human being. There are very few people in our lives whom we don't actually know, yet somehow assume will always be there. For me, Queen Elizabeth was one of these people, right? The Queen was there when I was born. She was there throughout my childhood. She was there through my adult life. Presidents came and went. Prime ministers came and went. The world changed around her. But the Queen was always there. And strangely enough, Dolly Parton occupied a similar little place in my consciousness. Dolly was always there. She was born in 1946 in the mountains of East Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children, growing up poor in a one-room cabin. This wasn't some carefully constructed Nashville origin story. Poverty was part of her life. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a hardworking and intelligent man, but he couldn't read or write, and Dolly never forgot that. She started singing in church, appeared on local television when she was 10, made her first record as a young teenager, and appeared at the Grand Ole Opry at 13. And the day after graduating from high school, she headed for Nashville. And from those Tennessee mountains came one of the greatest songwriters America has ever produced. Jolene, Coat of Many Colors, 9 to 5, and of course, I Will Always Love You. But there's a story behind that last song that tells you something important about Dolly Parton. She wrote I Will Always Love You when she was leaving Porter Wagner's television show in their professional partnership. It wasn't originally a romantic breakup song. It was Dolly saying goodbye to someone who had played an enormous role in her career. The song became a #1 country hit. And then Elvis Presley, the king himself, wanted to record it. Think about that for a moment. You're Dolly Parton. Elvis Presley, the biggest star on earth, wants to record your song. Dolly was thrilled. The session was being planned. Elvis had worked up the song. Dolly was supposed to go to the studio. And then the day before the session, Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, called. There was a condition. Parker told Dolly that when Elvis recorded somebody else's song, they expected a piece of the publishing, at least half, 50%. Dolly had to make a decision. Imagine the temptation. This was Elvis Presley. Almost anyone would have said, "Where do I sign?" But Dolly said no. She later said she cried all night over it. She loved Elvis and desperately wanted to hear him sing her song. But she understood something that a lot of performers never learn. The song was hers. She wrote it. She owned the publishing. And she wasn't giving half of her most valuable copyright away, not even to Elvis Presley. That decision tells you just how smart Dolly Parton was. Because nearly 20 years later, Whitney Houston recorded I Will Always Love You for the Bodyguard, and it became one of the biggest recordings in music history. Dolly still owned her song. That decision she cried over decades earlier paid off beyond anything she could possibly have imagined. That's Dolly. The big hair, the country girl joke sometimes allowed people to underestimate the woman underneath them, and I suspect Dolly was perfectly happy to let them. Because underneath all that rhinestone was one hell of a businesswoman. But I think an even greater legacy is something that has nothing to do with records. Dolly never forgot that her father couldn't read or write. She talked about how intelligent he was, how being unable to read had limited him. So in 1995, she started Dolly Parton's Imagination Library in her home county in Tennessee. The idea was beautifully simple. Send books to children free every month from birth until age 5. It began in one county. It spread across America and eventually internationally. By 2018, Dolly personally presented the 100th millionth book from the program to the Library of Congress, and it didn't stop there. By 2025, the program had passed 300 million books gifted, and today it sends books to more than 3 million children every month. Think about that legacy. 3 million children receiving a book every month because one little girl's father in the mountains of Tennessee couldn't read. She took something painful in her own family and turned it into opportunity for millions of other families. And here's another reason I loved Dolly. I didn't know who Dolly Parton voted for. No clue. Think about that. And think about how unusual that has become, especially over these last several years. We live in an age when actors, singers, athletes, and celebrities seem almost compelled to tell us what we're supposed to think about everything. Dolly wouldn't play that game. People tried to drag her into politics repeatedly. She resisted. Her basic philosophy was wonderfully simple. She was an entertainer. She didn't think being famous made her uniquely qualified to tell somebody else how to vote. And I love that about her. Not because I necessarily would have agreed or disagreed with Dolly politically. I don't know. I have no clue. That's the point. She understood something a lot of entertainers have forgotten. The people buying your records, watching your movies, and coming to your concerts aren't Republicans or Democrats. They are listening to your music. They're your audience. They're people. And Dolly wanted everybody at the table. I believe that refusal to become another political celebrity is one reason Dolly had the extraordinary longevity she did. America changed. Country music changed. Politics changed. Culture changed. Dolly remained Dolly. She could walk into a room containing conservatives, liberals, Christians, gay people, country folks, city folks, grandparents, teenagers, and somehow everybody seemed happy to see Dolly. That's a rare gift. And faith was part of who she was. She grew up singing in church. Her grandfather was a preacher. She spoke openly about believing in God and prayer without seeming interested in using her faith as a weapon against anybody else. Last year, Dolly suffered an enormous personal loss when her husband, Carl Dean, died. They had been married nearly 60 years. Imagine that. One of the most famous women in the world, married for almost 6 decades to a man who spent most of that time deliberately staying out of the spotlight. After Carl died, Dolly talked about rebuilding herself spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And now, just a year later, Dolly is gone too. 80 years old. I know 80 years is a long life. I know she accomplished more in those 80 years than most people could accomplish in several lifetimes. But somehow, I thought Dolly would always be there. And there's something else bothering me this morning. I never met her. I've been fortunate over the years. Radio and television have allowed me to meet some remarkable people. I got to meet Reba McEntire, and believe me, meeting Reba was awesome. But Dolly was the brass ring. If you'd asked me years ago to name the famous person I most wanted to meet before they died, Dolly Parton would have been right at the top of that list. But life has an interesting way of changing your perspective. Time passes. Things happen. Trauma becomes part of your life. Illness becomes part of your life. You begin understanding that your own clock is running too. And somewhere along the way, without me really noticing it, that wish changed. It stopped being, I hope I get to meet Dolly Parton before she dies, and became, I hope I get to meet Dolly Parton before I die. I didn't. And I regret that. I genuinely regret it. Because there are famous people you want to meet because they're famous. There are people you want to interview because they make great radio. And then there are people you'd simply like to sit across from for a few minutes and say, thank you. Thank you for the music. Thank you for the laughter. Thank you for proving that a poor little girl from the mountains of Tennessee could build an empire without forgetting where she came from. Thank you for understanding that owning what you create matters. Thank you for taking your father's inability to read and turning it into hundreds of millions of books for children. Thank you for having faith without demanding that everybody else believe exactly as you did. Thank you for entertaining us without lecturing us. And thank you for simply being Dolly. Yesterday, the Queen of Country Music died at 80 years old. And this morning, the world feels just a little different to me. Because for my entire life, Dolly was always there. I truly thought she would always be. Rest in peace, Dolly, and thank you. I will always love you. All right, folks, this is the Joe Mangiacotti Show. Normally, we do air on AM 830 WCRN. I mean, we do air, but some technical difficulty has not allowed us to connect to the station this morning. So we are strictly streaming So if you're watching this on Facebook or X, Twitch TV, Instagram, Rumble, YouTube, any of the multiple ways that we can stream the show, thank you for sticking with us. And you can call this show today, even though it won't go through the radio station. I do have a phone line here patched in. So if you'd like to join us at 508-556-4411, feel free to do that. And you can also text us at 617-297-8388, 617-297-8388. So multiple ways to watch and multiple ways to listen. Now, just a quick programming note, and I'll do some other promotion on this because I've got something new coming that is really exciting, and I'm excited about it. And most of you know me from here, the Joe Mangiacotti Show, where every day we're talking politics, government, the Constitution, and the biggest stories in the news. But there is another side of my life that many of you know about as well. And I've been a private investigator for more than 4 decades. And it's time I leaned into that. Coming soon, I'm launching a brand new show and podcast, Case Files with Joe Mangiacotti. And Case Files is going to places we don't normally have time to go to on this show. We're going to investigate the mysteries, controversies, and unanswered questions that have fascinated people for years. Famous cases, unsolved mysteries, government secrets, historical controversies, strange events, even alleged cover-ups, and yes, conspiracy theories. But we're going to approach them the way an investigator should. What's the claim? What's the evidence? What can we actually prove? What's merely speculation? And sometimes the most interesting question of all, what doesn't add up? We're starting with it's a conspiracy. And we're not starting with that's crazy. No, we're opening the case file and following the evidence where it leads. Some episodes will feature experts, some will revisit famous cases, some may take us down rabbit holes we never expected. And I suspect every once in a while we're going to finish an investigation with more questions than answers. That's okay. That's what investigators do. We'll be announcing the official launch dates shortly, along with exactly where you can listen, watch, and subscribe. But you can get in on it right now. Look for Case Files with Joe Mangiacotti on Facebook. Follow the page, and that's where we'll begin posting updates, upcoming investigation, and details about the launch. And if there's a case, mystery, or controversy you think I should investigate, I want to hear about that too. I've spent more than 40 years asking questions for a living. Now we're opening some new files. Case Files with Joe Mangiacotti, coming soon. All right, folks, again, not hitting the terrestrial today, right? So this show, this edition, this episode, Wednesday, the 26th of August, is a complete streaming edition of the show. And it's right now going out on Twitch TV, LinkedIn profile, Rumble, YouTube, even Instagram, X, of course, my account there. So there's multiple ways to watch and stream. But just because it's a replay on AM 830 today and not this live show doesn't mean you can't participate. You can always participate with the text line at 617-297-8388, 617-297-8388. And I did switch over. If you'd like to give us a call at 508-556-4411, that's 508-556-4411. Of course, it's right there on the Chiron below me. It will ring here. And assuming I see it ring, I guess, because I don't have a producer physically for the Cameo Studios, my producer's always at the station. But I'll catch it and we'll play Russian roulette here, right? We'll just answer the phone and take the call up that way. So we're having a little fun with it today. But there was another story that I definitely wanted to touch on, and maybe I'll save this for tomorrow for the terrestrial listeners as well. But let me get into this. 6-1. What are you talking about, Joe? 6-1. That's the ratio. When taxpayers become political donors without their consent. See, I want you to imagine something this morning. You live in Los Angeles. There's a candidate running for mayor whose politics you absolutely despise. Maybe they're too far left for you. Maybe they're far right, too far right for you. It doesn't matter. You don't support them. You don't want them elected. You certainly don't want to give them your money or the taxpayers' money. And then somebody else gives that candidate a qualifying dollar. And the city of Los Angeles can effectively reach into the public treasury and put $6 more behind it. 6-1. It's called public campaign financing. I have another name for it, California legal. Because I don't think this is going to, if someone will challenge this, pass constitutional muster. Because apparently you've reached the point where politicians aren't satisfied collecting your taxes to operate the government. Now government money can help finance politicians trying to obtain control of the government. And I have a very serious problem with that. Government has a job. When I pay taxes, there's a basic understanding about what that money is for. Police, fire departments, emergency services, roads, infrastructure, housing programs, sanitation, schools, service for people who genuinely need government assistance. The legitimate functions of a municipal government. What I don't believe government should be doing is taking money from the public treasury and putting it into political campaigns. Because here's the question nobody should be afraid to ask. Why should one citizen be compelled through taxation to help financially political speech with which that citizen profoundly disagrees? Suppose candidate Smith believes everything you oppose. You don't contribute to candidate Smith, just don't donate. You actively oppose candidate Smith. Maybe you contribute to candidate Jones specifically because you want Smith defeated. Yet qualifying contributions to Smith can unlock taxpayer money for Smith's campaign. That means public dollars can ultimately purchase mailers, advertising, campaign staff, signs, digital advertising, and political messaging designed to elect someone you don't want in office. I think there's a legitimate First Amendment question here, right? And I'd like to see, rather, somebody take that question all the way through the courts. But let me be precise about the law, because there's an important distinction here. I'm not telling you this morning that the Supreme Court has already ruled Los Angeles 6-1 program unconstitutional. It hasn't. In fact, public campaign financing systems have existed for decades. But the Supreme Court has demonstrated that public financing isn't automatically immune from First Amendment scrutiny. In Arizona Free Enterprise Club versus Bennett, the court struck down an Arizona mechanism under which spending by privately financed candidates could trigger additional taxpayer funding for their publicly financed opponents. The court concluded that mechanism burdened political speech. Los Angeles system isn't identical, that's important, but I think there's another constitutional question worth litigating. What about compelled financial support for political speech itself? I understand the government's response. Taxes fund things individual taxpayers disagree with every day, don't they, right? Certain books might be in the library or available to grades you think are inappropriate, right? Schools have maybe drag story time that you don't agree with. So taxes do fund things that individuals disagree with every day. A pacifist cannot withhold a portion of his federal taxes supporting the Pentagon. A conservative can't individually opt out of programs created by Democrats. A liberal can't withhold taxes from programs enacted by Republicans. Government couldn't function otherwise, fair enough. But campaigning is different. This isn't governing. This is political speech designed to determine who gets to govern. That's precisely why I think the question deserves scrutiny. 6 government dollars for 1 private dollar. And look at the incentive we've created here. Instead of telling candidates, go convince people to support you, we say, go convince somebody to give you a qualifying contribution, and government can multiply part of it 6 times. Why? If your ideas are popular, raise your money. If people believe in your candidacy, convince them to contribute. If nobody wants to contribute to your campaign, perhaps this information voters should know. Also, your ability to raise money speaks to your pliability as a candidate, to your electability, right? People, in general, the electorate, makes a determination through donation as to whether you are an electable candidate. Not just on your policies, but whether you have the ability to actually win that race. So that speaks volumes. And don't tell me, but Joe, this helps ordinary candidates compete with wealthy interests. That's the strongest argument for the program. Supporters say small donor match makes candidates pay attention to ordinary residents instead of spending all day courting wealthy donors, corporations, and political power brokers. I understand the argument. I still don't buy the remedy. If big money corrupts politics, regulate corruption, enforce disclosure laws, prosecute bribery, right? Police illegal coordination, stop it. Establish lawful contribution limits, but don't solve the problem by turning the taxpayer into the politician's involuntary venture capitalist. Now, let's pull the camera back here because this isn't occurring in isolation. California has become ground zero for a much larger national argument over election administration. Mail-in ballots, ballot collection, what critics call ballot harvesting, right? Drop boxes, voter identification, ballot curing procedures, long counting periods. And we need to be careful with our language here. Those practices are not evidence by themselves that an election is fraudulent, but Americans absolutely have the right to debate whether particular election procedures maximize security, transparency, and public confidence. And California is having that fight right now. The fact, or rather in fact, the voters this November will consider a constitutional amendment that would impose additional voter identification and citizenship verification requirements. California currently does not generally require voters to present government-issued photo identification every time they vote. The proposed amendment would change that. So apparently, millions of Californians themselves think this is a debate worth having. Then there's the Stop Nick Shirley Act. Just days ago, Governor Gavin Newsom signed AB 2624. Republican critics have nicknamed it Stop Shirley Act. Now, accuracy matters. That's not its official name. The law expands California's safe at home address confidentiality program, qualifying employees of certain immigration nonprofits. So supporters say these workers have faced threats, harassment, and doxing and deserve protection. Critics, including people angered by Nick Shirley's investigative videos, fear the law could make it more difficult to identify or investigate people connected with publicly funded organizations. That's the legitimate argument. So don't tell me simply it's the Stop Nick Shirley Act and stop there. Tell me what it actually does. Then let's debate that, because my principle works both ways, right? Government should not be able to hide legitimate wrongdoing behind privacy protection, but neither should someone's home address become fair game merely because somebody disagrees with his politics or his work. Protect people from genuine threats, protect journalists' ability to investigate, and prosecute actual fraud wherever it exists. These principles shouldn't be partisan. Here's where I come down on the 6-to-1 program. The Nick Shirley fight is complicated. Election administration is complicated. This isn't. I don't want government financing politicians. Republican, Democrat, socialist, libertarian, progressive, conservative, I don't care. If a Republican candidate I loved we're receiving $6 taxpayer dollars for every qualifying private dollar. I'd oppose the principle there too. Because government exists to serve citizens. Politicians should have to convince citizens voluntarily to finance their campaigns. The taxpayer shouldn't become an involuntary campaign donor. And there's something almost backwards about the politicians telling us that democracy requires government to subsidize politicians. No. Democracy requires politicians to convince me to vote for you. Convince me your ideas are better. And if you want campaign contribution, convince me to give to you. Don't take money from the public treasury and tell me it's somehow promoting political freedom. Because political freedom includes something extraordinarily important: the freedom to say no. No, I don't support you. No, I won't vote for you. And no, I don't want to finance your campaign. 6-1? Make it 60-1. And the principle doesn't change. Political support ought to be voluntary. And if politicians cannot convince enough citizens to voluntarily support their campaigns, taxpayers shouldn't be forced to come riding in to their rescue. That's not how it works. And that's how I see that. Again, we're only streaming today's show because of technical difficulties to connecting to the station. So you can actually call in at the 50. This is the Cameo number. I put it on the Chiron, folks. 508-556-4411. And of course, you can still text us at 617-297-8388. 617-297-8388. We have no new texts here this morning, but that's how we're dealing with this. All right, there was one other story I did want to touch on because we were all watching the South Carolina situation, right? Because of Lindsey Graham's untimely passing here. So I have this to say on this. It's the president. Mr. President, sometimes you have to let voters decide. See, President Trump got another victory last night, right? His candidate, Darlene Graham, defeated Congressman Ralph Norman in the South Carolina Republican Senate runoff. And before somebody misunderstands what I'm about to say, let me establish something. I completely understood the decision to appoint Darlene Graham to her late brother Lindsey's seat. There was something fitting about it, right? Lindsey Graham died suddenly. South Carolina needed somebody to finish the term. His sister had spent her career in public service. Governor Henry McMaster appointed her. Trump urged him, even called him. Fine. Let her finish her brother's term. Let her honor Lindsey. Let her keep the seat warm until South Carolina's decide who should represent them for the next 6 years. But that's where I think the president should have stopped. Because an appointment to complete your brother's unfinished term in an election to a 6-year term as a United States Senate are two different things. And Republicans cannot afford to forget that distinction. It's a big distinction. The Senate is not ceremonial. Control of Congress is extraordinarily important. A Senate majority determines committees. It affects legislation, judges, executive appointments, investigations, the entire ability of the president to move an agenda through Washington. And Republicans don't have Senate seats to waste. So when you're selecting the Republican nominee for the United States Senate seat, I think the overriding question ought to be who is prepared to do the job and who gives the party the strongest opportunity to hold the seat, not who has the right last name, not who deserves an opportunity because of a family tragedy, and not even who does Donald Trump personally like. And this is where I disagree with President Trump. Trump didn't simply say something nice about Darlene Graham. He went all in. He encouraged her to run. He endorsed her. He went to South Carolina and campaigned for her. His political operation spent hundreds of thousands of dollars helping her. And Trump essentially told South Carolina Republicans, treat this as though I'm on the ballot. Mr. President, you weren't. Darlene Graham and Ralph Norman are. And sometimes even presidents enormously popular with Republican voters needs to stand aside and allow those voters to make their own decision. I don't think Trump needed to pick a side here, is my bottom line, right? Let Darlene make her case. Let Ralph Norman make his. Let South Carolina Republicans look at their records, experience, ideology, electability, and then support the winner with everything you've got in November. There was a real experience question here. This wasn't some manufactured campaign attack. Darlene Graham had never previously held elected office. Ralph Norman had spent years in Congress and had an established record. That doesn't automatically make Norman the better senator. Experience can sometimes be enormously overrated in Washington. Donald Trump himself proved that someone can enter the presidency without previously holding political office, right? I mean, none. But the absence of experience becomes more concerning when a candidate is asked about Taiwan and South China Sea and responds that she's not particularly informed of national security. Now that should matter. A United States senator votes on war, defense spending, treaties, weapon systems, military appointments, intelligence matters, foreign aid. America's relationship with China, Russia, Iran, and our allies. You don't need to be Henry Kissinger to run for Senate, but national security can't be something you plan to start learning about after receiving the job. Now, Graham recognized that she stumbled. And there's a perfectly legitimate argument on her side. She said the people she encountered were talking about groceries, gasoline, and healthcare, not the South China Sea. And she's right about what occupies most people's daily lives. But senators don't get to choose between domestic policy and national security. They have to understand both. Now, here's the argument against me, right? It's a pretty good one. Joe, what exactly did Trump do wrong? Darlene Graham won. Republican voters heard the arguments. They saw the debate. They knew she was Lindsey Graham's sister. They knew Norman had congressional experience. They knew Trump endorsed her, and 52.5% chose Graham. That's democracy. Absolutely. I'm not questioning the result. South Carolina Republicans made their decision. Darlene Graham is their nominee. My question is different. Should Donald Trump have put his thumb so heavily on the scale in the first place? Because presidential political capital isn't unlimited. The Trump endorsement should mean something. This is actually bigger than Darlene Graham. Donald Trump's endorsement is probably the most valuable commodity in Republican primary politics. And because it's valuable, I think it should be used carefully. If Trump endorses everybody he likes, if loyalty becomes the primary qualification, if an endorsement becomes repayment for friendship, then eventually the endorsement stops telling Republican voters this is the strongest person to advance our agenda and starts telling them this is the person I personally want. Those aren't necessarily the same thing, folks. Trump himself suggested his support for Darlene was connected partly to his relationship with Lindsey. And I understand that. Loyalty is one of Trump's defining characteristics. Sometimes that's admirable. But choosing United States senators cannot become a memorial gesture. There's another side to this. Darlene Graham's supporters would say, I'm selling her short. She spent years in public service. She understands disability issues. She's an outsider. She isn't a Washington creature. And perhaps somebody who hasn't spent decades climbing the political ladder exactly what Washington needs. Fair argument. And there's another fact that complicates my concern. South Carolina remains a very Republican state. This isn't currently regarded as the seat most likely to determine Senate control, not by a long shot. So perhaps Trump's calculated that South Carolina gave him the luxury of supporting somebody he genuinely believed in. But we're going to find out in November. But here's my principle. Presidents are presidents. They aren't Republican primary voters in chief. There are times when presidential involvement makes sense. There's a weak candidate who could lose a winnable seat. Get involved. There's somebody fundamentally opposed to the president's agenda pretending otherwise. Make the case. But when you've got Republicans competing in a Republican state, there are times when the president should simply say, South Carolina, you decide. It's your seat. Then, the morning after the primary, congratulations to our nominee. Now let's win in November. Instead, Trump made this partially referendum on himself, and he won. Darlene Graham won. So congratulations to Senator Graham. Now comes the part that matters. She has to demonstrate that South Carolina Republicans didn't merely elect Lindsey Graham's sister, they elected a United States senator. She needs to get educated quickly on national security. She needs to build her own political identity. She needs to unite the nearly 48% of runoff voters who chose Ralph Norman. And she needs to prove she deserves this nomination because of Darlene Graham, not because of Lindsey Graham, and not because of Donald Trump. Because ultimately, senators don't belong to presidents. Senate seats don't belong to families. They belong to the people of the state they represent. All right, folks. Again, this is the Joe Mangiacotti Show, Wednesday edition. Technical difficulty prevented us from connecting to the station. Therefore, a replay is going out. And if you're watching this or listening to this, it's 100% streaming. But the good news is on that. So many platforms for that. We stream to WCRN's Facebook page, my Facebook page, my X account, my LinkedIn profile, Twitch TV, even on Instagram, as well as YouTube. The Joe Mangiacotti Show has a YouTube channel. It has a Rumble channel. So there's so many ways to listen and so many ways to watch. And you can even call in. You're going to do it more directly to me instead of going through the station. So the number for today is 508-556-4411. And of course, our text line is up and running at 617-297-8388, 617-297-8388. Now, just another real quick story that's in the news today is this Canadian standoff, right? This Canadian issue that we have going on, Trump versus Canada. Who actually wins in a trade war? We've got a trade war breaking out with Canada, and apparently we're also renaming lakes now. That's cool. Hey, if Gulf of Mexico can become Gulf of America, why can't we do it anywhere else? Canada announced yesterday that it is retaliating against President Trump's latest tariffs. Beginning September 8th, Canada will impose tariffs ranging from 15 to 50% on roughly 700 categories of American products, representing about $27.6 billion, Canadian dollars in imports, right? That's going to be steel, aluminum, dairy products, appliances, agricultural equipment, electronics, and food, and a whole lot more. Why? Because President Trump just hit approximately the same value of Canadian products with tariffs reaching 50%. Trump hits Canada, Canada hits America. And now everybody waits to see who blinks. Here's my problem. At some point, right, somebody has to remember that the United States and Canada are customers of each other. We're talking about nearly $900 billion in annual trade. These aren't two economies operating independently, folks. We build things together. We sell things to each other. American companies buy Canadian materials. Canadian companies buy American components. Farmers sell across the border. Energy crosses the border. Manufacturing supply chains cross the border. Sometimes components cross that border multiple times before somebody buys the finished product. So this isn't economic warfare where we can bomb somebody else's factory and go home. We're connected to the factory. Now, I understand what President Trump is doing, and I think some of his critics deliberately pretend they don't. Trump believes America has spent decades allowing other countries access to the world's greatest consumer market, while those countries protect their own industries. His message is, those days are over. He's been talking about this for decades. You want access to 340 million American consumers? Fine. Then American businesses get fair access to your consumers. And if they don't, tariffs. There's nothing inherently crazy about using America's economic leverage to demand reciprocity by that question, right? So what's the end game? Because tariffs make sense to me as leverage. They make considerable less sense as a permanent condition. That's unsustainable. If I threaten Canada with a tariff and Canada eliminates an unfair trade barrier, terrific, make the deal, remove the tariff, right? Everybody goes back to business. But if I put 50% on Canada, Canada puts 50% on us, I respond with 75, they respond with 70. Congratulations, we haven't achieved free trade. We've achieved mutually assured taxation, and somebody eventually pays those bills. Businesses pay, consumers pay, workers pay when companies lose markets. And politicians keep telling everybody they're winning. Here's something else Americans need to understand. Canada isn't simply throwing darts at a catalog of American products. They're being strategic here. They're targeting products that can cause economic and therefore political pain inside the United States. That's how trade wars work. You don't just ask what can be taxed, you asked, what can we tax that makes somebody powerful pick up the telephone and call the White House? And Canada has another card. Ontario Premier Doug Ford is already talking about electricity and critical minerals. Now we're getting into serious territory because energy isn't a bottle of maple syrup. Critical minerals aren't hockey sticks. Those are strategic resources. So before this escalates further, somebody needs to answer a very basic question. What does victory look like? What specifically does Canada have to change for President Trump to say, deal, tariffs come off? Because if there isn't an answer to that question, then this isn't leverage anymore. It's just a trade war. And then because apparently international economic warfare wasn't entertaining enough, President Trump announced he's considering renaming Lake Ontario to Lake America. Mr. President, I appreciate the trolling. I really do. I appreciate a great troll. There just is one small problem. We only own about 40% of it. Actually, 47% of it. Apparently, Canada wasn't consulted about the other 53%. But underneath the joke, I'm not convinced, antagonizing the Canadians just for support, or just for sport rather, helps us get the agreement we supposedly want. Canada is not China. Canada is not Iran. Canada isn't Russia. Canada is our neighbor, our ally, and one of our largest trading partners. That doesn't mean we let Canada take advantage of us. Quite the opposite. If Canada maintains unfair barriers against American products, challenge them. Use American leverage. Negotiate aggressively. Demand reciprocity. But then make the deal. Because the objective isn't tariffs. The objective is better trade. And that's the standard I'm going to use to judge Trump's strategy. 6 months from now, did American companies gain better access to Canada? Did manufacturing increase? Did American workers benefit? Did investment come home? Did Canadian barriers come down? Then Donald Trump can say, I told you tariffs were a leverage. But if we're sitting here 6 months from now with 50, 75, or 100% tariffs, flying back and forth and prices increasing and American exporters losing Canadian customers, The conservatives shouldn't pretend that's winning merely because a Republican president is doing it. Tariffs are a weapon. Weapons are supposed to accomplish objectives. So tell me the objective, tell me the exit strategy, and then show me the results. Because ultimately, I don't care whether Trump wins the argument with Mark Carney. I want America to win the deal. We'll see what happens. Time will tell on this, but I think he should have a much better play on this. All right, folks, one more time, I want to tell you about a new show that will be coming up, video podcast that we'll be doing, a quick programming note, if you will. Most of you do know me from this show, the Joe Mangiacotti Show, where we, every day we're talking about politics and government and the Constitution and the biggest stories in the news. But the other side of my life that many of you also know from listening to me for decades on this station and other New England stations is I've been a private investigator for more than 4 decades, and it's time to lean into that. So coming soon, I'll be launching a brand new show in podcast, Case Files with Joe Mangiacotti. And Case Files is going to places we don't normally have time to go to on this show. We're going to investigate the mysteries, controversies, and unanswered questions that have fascinated people for years. Famous cases, unsolved mysteries, government secrets, historical controversies, strange events, alleged cover-ups, and yes, folks, of course, conspiracy theories. But we're going to approach them the way an investigator should. What's the claim? What's the evidence? What can we actually prove? What's merely speculation? And sometimes the most interesting question of all, what does not add up? We're not starting with, it's a conspiracy, and we're not starting with, oh, that's crazy. We're opening the case file, and we're following the evidence where it leads. Some episodes will feature experts, some will revisit famous cases, some may take us down rabbit holes we never expected. And I suspect every once in a while, we're going to finish an investigation with more questions than answers. That's okay. That's what investigators do all the time. So we'll be announcing the official launch date shortly, along with exactly where you can listen, watch, and subscribe, but you can get it now. Look for it on Facebook, Case Files with Joe Mangiacotti on Facebook. Follow the page, and that's where we'll begin posting updates, upcoming investigations, and details about the launch. And if there's a case, mystery, or controversy you think I should investigate, I want to hear about that too. I've spent more than 40 years asking questions for a living. Now we're opening some new files, Case Files with Joe Mangiacotti, coming soon. All right, folks, I think that will wrap up today's edition, again, because we're not structured with the terrestrial station today and just for streaming, no commercials, as you can tell. I mean, the other story, and I think I'll cover this on tomorrow's Thursday's edition, assuming that all our technical difficulties are fixed, is Meta's $17 billion question. Something extraordinary happened this morning. Meta, the company behind Facebook and Instagram, has agreed to a settlement worth up to roughly $17 billion, with states accusing the company of designing social media products in ways that harm young people. $17 billion. And this isn't simply Meta pulling out the corporate checkbook and saying, everybody happy now? They're agreeing to change the product. Teenagers will face daily usage limits, overnight access restrictions, notification restrictions. Children under 13 aren't supposed to be on the platforms at all. And here in Massachusetts, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars potentially coming to the Commonwealth. So I have 2 reactions. First, good. Children are not simply miniature adults. If you're deliberately designing technology that keeps people staring at the screen for as long as humanly possible, you have a greater responsibility when the person staring at that screen is 14 years old. But my second reaction is the investigator in me. And investigators are always interested in timing, because Meta didn't suddenly discover these lawsuits this morning. They've been fighting these allegations for years. And they didn't settle this case 6 months ago. They settled it during the trial. Instagram CEO Adam Mosseri had begun to testify. Prosecutors were questioning him about Meta's teen safety programs, Mark Zuckerberg was expected to take the witness stand, and now settlement. Let me be very clear. Settling a lawsuit is not an admission of guilt. Companies settle cases all the time because litigation is expensive, unpredictable, and dangerous. And when your potential exposure could conceivably reach tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, there are perfectly rational reasons to make that deal. But $17 billion isn't lunch money. So I want to know, what did Meta decide it didn't want to risk happening in that courtroom? And then there's an even bigger question. For years, we've debated whether social media is simply something kids chose to use too much, or whether some of these products were deliberately engineered to make putting the phone down extraordinarily difficult. Infinite scrolling, notifications, recommendations, likes, algorithms feeds, or algorithmic feeds. One video leads immediately into another. Everything designed around one objective: stay here, because your attention has values. The longer you're looking at the screen, the more valuable you become to the platform. That's a business. But here's where I draw the line. An 11-year-old isn't a sophisticated consumer negotiating with a trillion-dollar technology company. If these companies know their design or their designs choose affect children differently, then they have a responsibility to act accordingly. Don't you agree? And apparently this settlement is going to force Meta to do exactly that. Now, I'm also a conservative, and that means I'm uncomfortable when government's immediate answer to every problem becomes more government, more regulation. Parents have a responsibility here too, maybe more responsibility than anybody. The government isn't your child's parent. Mark Zuckerberg isn't your child's parent either. You are. Parents need to know what their children are doing online. They need to establish limits. They need to occasionally, right? They need to use that ancient parental word that seems to have fallen out of fashion. No. But parental responsibility doesn't absolve corporations from corporate responsibilities. These two ideas can coexist. Parents have an obligation to protect their children. Companies have an obligation not to knowingly exploit children's vulnerabilities. And government has a legitimate role in enforcing laws when companies cross legal lines. And that's not socialism, that's the rule of law. Now, Massachusetts may receive at least $366 million from this settlement and potentially considerably more. And here's where I'm going to become very Massachusetts for a moment. I want receipts. If this money is supposed to address harm allegedly caused to young people by social media, then show taxpayers where every dollar goes. Don't tell me $366 million is going to some enormous Beacon Hill pot and somebody someday will figure out what happened to it. It's for the children. Spend it on the children. If it's for education, show the programs. If it's for digital literacy, show us the results. Transparency shouldn't disappear simply because the defendant wrote a very large check. And finally, there's something historically interesting happening here. For years, big tech told Washington, we aren't publishers, we're platforms. We're protected by Section 230. And if you've ever listened to me, this show, for any length of time, you know this has been a pet peeve of mine. I've talked about Section 230 forever. But courts are increasingly confronting another question. What if the lawsuit isn't about what some idiot posts on Facebook? What if it's about Facebook itself? What if it's about the design of the product, the algorithm, the notifications, the engagement mechanism? That's a completely different question. In this case, may ultimately become one of the milestones of America's changing relationship with big tech. We spent the first 20 years of social media asking, look what this technology can do. Maybe the next 20 years are going to involve asking, look at what this technology did and what should we do about it. Meta just put roughly 17 billion reasons on the table for us to have that conversation. Now, Section 230 came into play in the late 90s as the internet was developing and technology we've never seen on the planet before, and we didn't really know how to deal with it. So the question became, who's responsible for what's on there? So the firms like Meta, Facebook, all of these would say, hey, we're just a platform, right? A platform. We are not editors. We're not a publication. So we don't have to do that. But then they would exercise editorial judgment, and they would censor, and they would shadow ban, and they'd drop things. And they said they have the right to do that. Well, you have to decide, and Section 230 has to be readdressed. Are these platforms just platforms, or are they publications? Because we, as a radio station at WCRN, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Herald, it doesn't matter. There are laws and rules and decorum that govern these things. And if you are claiming you're just a platform, a tool, the same as a screwdriver or a hammer, then there should be no shadow banning or censorship on what can be put on there. So it's a very complicated and a very serious question, folks. But we got to wrap up the Wednesday edition of the Joe Mangiacotti Show. Sorry we didn't air on the station today. This is a 100% streaming show today. And I thank you for those that stuck by and those watching it now online or Rumble or Facebook or YouTube, whatever it is. Thank you so much. But I will be back live and hopefully on terrestrial radio at 11 a.m. on Thursday for the Thursday edition of the Joe Mangiacotti Show on AM 830 WCRN. Joe out.